so I'm always excited to talk about birds in any possible way. So today Morgan has asked me to focus on owls, and so I am focusing on the owls we have here in North Carolina. Looking at the title, I've got 5 species there, 4 of which are ones that are typically found throughout North Carolina, although one is in decline. And then the snowy is sort of a special one that I've decided to include, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I do want everyone to know that this is by no means a complete list of owls in North Carolina. It's just that if I talked about all of them, we'd be here for a couple of hours. So I had to pick and choose. So let's get started. So first, in the title, it sort of went by alphabetical order, but I've decided to go by size order in the presentation. So we're going to start with one of our smallest owls, which is the eastern screech owl. Very cute little owl. And these guys are pretty common throughout the state. However, a lot of folks don't really get to see them. A lot of birders, even those of us that spend a lot of time in the field, have heard eastern screech owl, but not necessarily seen eastern screech owl. And part of the reason is that they tend to be a little bit more reclusive than some of our other owl species, and also the fact that they are so tiny. So they will be hard to see for multiple reasons. But here's a couple of calls so you know what to listen for. That's sort of their typical whinny or trill call. And then they also have another call called a tremolo, which is more of a communication between a mated pair. So it's a little bit lower, and it's sort of like they're whispering to each other in the dark to make sure they're still nearby. They're pretty distinct calls, especially when we hear some of the other owls. In terms of identification, other than being small, you can see in this picture, it has very distinct ear tufts, and these are almost always held erect. So they have a pretty typical silhouette to look for. So you're going to see these little projections on the top of their head. But again, overall, they have sort of a really mottled color. And we're going to talk about how they have various plumages in a minute. But you can kind of see that they're really well camouflaged when they're sitting in or on a tree. Sorry about that. So in terms of size, again, this is one of our smallest owls in North America. They are about the size of a robin, so that surprises a lot of folks. So most of us are pretty used to seeing robins, and so we know kind of that size. They can appear a little bit larger just because their feathers can be sort of puffed out, especially if it's colder outside or in the nighttime. They tend to kind of puff themselves up for multiple reasons, sometimes to appear bigger for other predators. But again, just in terms of size and weight, they're pretty tiny. Their wingspan ranges from about 18.9 inches to 24 inches. So again, wings are really large, which is true of a lot of raptors. So they usually have a very large wingspan and makes them very powerful flyers, which is great when you're chasing after other living things. In terms of weight, they're only about 4.3 to 8.6 ounces. And lengthwise, they don't get above 10 inches total. So something really unique and interesting about eastern screech owls is they are the only owl in North America that has multiple plumages or colorations. And there's a couple of different reasons for this, but they're typically known to have 2 morphs or colorations, and that is the rufous or sort of reddish color that you see on the left, and then the gray morph, which is on the right. And you won't often see these 2 in the same area, so this is a pretty interesting picture here. The reddish rufous morph is more of what we would probably see here in the Southeast and in North Carolina. It's more for sort of humid forests and kind of thicker wetland type areas. And the gray morph tends to be more in the northeast. So sort of colder climates, more sort of coniferous trees. So for whatever reason, part of why they think that they have developed these different morphs is to sort of blend in with those specific environments and sort of the trees that are in those areas. But it also is partly due to genetics, and it may also be part of natural selection. So owls that are sort of a random color somehow ended up surviving and being more camouflage from predators. And so that coloration continues on in that area. So the range of the eastern screech owl covers a really good part of the United States. So it really goes throughout the Midwest and even into some of the Western states, but very typical throughout the eastern US. Really not super common in Maine and the northern parts of New Hampshire and Vermont, but definitely throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states, and certainly here in the Southeast, they are fairly common. These are year-round owls, so they don't migrate. A lot of our birds do migrate, and we're sort of in that time of year where we're seeing a lot of winter species here in North Carolina that will be moving out in spring migration. But the nice thing about a lot of our owls is they stay here year-round, so we have 12 months of the year opportunities to see them. So the inset picture there is the brown morph. So a lot of folks do recognize that there's also a third morph or coloration for eastern screech owls. And this one has been found in Florida. And again, they're just sort of assuming that it's something that this owl has adapted to a specific type of habitat and tree cover in that area. And so now there's often considered a third morph, but a lot of times you'll still see that they generally just put it into two coloration groups, that rufous and gray. In terms of food, they have a pretty varied diet. So starting from the upper left and going counterclockwise, they will eat small birds. So we have here a house finch, and sometimes they'll even eat larger birds. So if you think about the fact that this bird is the size of a robin and it could potentially go after something like a blue jay, that's a pretty tough little bird right there. So it's definitely willing to go after prey its size or maybe even slightly larger. On the bottom left, we have a skink, so it definitely goes after lots of little reptiles and amphibians. It will also eat things like crayfish and earthworms. And then it will go after things like bats, which is pretty impressive because bats are known to be great flyers and really agile, especially at night when these guys will be hunting. And then, of course, most of their diet is going to be comprised of small mammals, which is pretty typical for owls in general. Now, the picture of the screech owl at the top is not just to say, oh, here's a screech owl and all of its food. These guys may be cute and cuddly looking, but they can also be cannibalistic. So that is why that picture is there, because it will eat other screech owls. In terms of nesting and breeding, they're a little bit unique from some of our other owls in the fact that they use cavity nests. So they're going to look for existing cavities in trees. So again, that first picture we saw, and also the picture here on the bottom left, shows them sort of hanging out in a nice hollowed out tree. They will not excavate their own cavities like woodpeckers. So they're going to use holes that woodpeckers or wood ducks or other animals have previously used. They're not really all that excited to build a nest, so they don't actually clean that space out. They are not going to bring in things like sticks or grasses. They don't really do anything to the existing structure. So if the last bird left some things behind, great. They're just going to drop their eggs into whatever is there. They typically lay 2 to 6 eggs in a group. They only have one brood per year. A lot of our smaller birds will have multiple broods per year. If you think of things like bluebirds, sometimes they can have 2 to 4 broods per year. But part of the reason that owls typically will only have 1 or maybe 2 is because the period of time from the time the egg is laid to when those young are actually independent and on their own is a pretty long period of time. So it takes a good chunk of the year for them to sort of get those babies to be independent. So the incubation period for the eggs is 27 to 34 days. Typically during this time, the female is the one that incubates the eggs most of the time. So the male will be bringing her food. And then once those babies are hatched, they stay in the nest for another month or so. The mom is going to be pulling apart the food that dad brings and feeding the babies little chunks until they're old enough to eat bigger chunks or maybe even whole prey. And even beyond that nestling period, a lot of times these babies will stay with the parents for 8 to 10 weeks and continue to be fed and cared for. A lot of times when I have bird walks, I talk to folks about how it's pretty amazing that these little birds, things like bluebirds and chickadees and wrens, they have a pretty fast turnaround rate from the time those eggs hatch to the time those babies are flying out of the nest and going out on their own. And raptor babies tend to be among the biggest babies. So you think of these big, powerful predator birds, and those babies really linger and make mom and dad take care of them for a really ridiculously long time. In terms of predator evasion, because again, these guys are pretty small, so there are going to be other animals that can and will go after them, including some of our larger owls. So they do need to come up with some techniques in evading these predators. So of course they have that great built-in camouflage, and they're small, and of course living in cavities will help a little bit as well. But they have this really cool tree branch mimic technique. So during the day, they're going to conceal themselves in trees, and they might just be sitting out on a branch. One of their hunting techniques is to actually drop down from a branch that's maybe 6 to 10 feet off the ground and basically just pounce on their prey rather than flying through the forest to find it. So as a result, they need to sort of figure out a way to stay hidden both from their prey and from other predators. So what they'll do is they'll take their bodies and sort of stretch themselves out as thin as possible, and they're pretending that they're a stick. And apparently they take this to the next level because they won't just sit there. They'll actually sway back and forth and close their eyes until they're almost just little slits so they can still see, but you can't see that bright yellow color anymore. And as the wind blows and the rest of the tree moves, they'll sway back and forth and like, oh, I'm a stick. I'm not an owl, I'm a stick. So pretty interesting behavior. So moving up quite a few sizes, we have our barn owl. This is an owl that I would say you'd be very lucky to see here in North Carolina. I just got my life bird barn owl a few years ago because I had a tip from another birder about a place more into the western part of the state where one had been spotted. But even among birders, we have to be really careful to not put out reports that state specifically where the bird is found because they have declined so much throughout the eastern US and especially here in the southeast in North Carolina. Birders and folks in general are pretty protective of these birds. And so when you put a report on eBird, for those of you that are familiar with that app where you can report all the birds you see, you sort of have to just put it on a county level when you see a barn owl. You don't want to state specifically where you found it, but you can put, oh, I found it in this county or in this general area. And that way that bird gets a little bit more protection because they are so rare. Folks really do want to see them and maybe photograph them, and we really don't want to put too much stress on that bird. So you try to only share it with folks that will be respectful and try to see it from a distance and not necessarily go straight up to the barn or straight up to the roosting site that that bird happens to have. Barn owls are known for their really scary and sort of haunting call. It's pretty distinctive, and there's not much else that sounds like this, and it's certainly not something you want to hear when you're out camping. So again, I know that was a little faint, but certainly something you would think of in a horror movie or something similar. So barn owls are known for their heart-shaped faces, very light cream colored to white colored. So again, this is a little face in the dark that you won't soon forget. Any light is going to filter right into that face, and it's so much lighter than the rest of the body. They're often called the ghost owls for this reason, because they are really light colored overall. And again, that haunting call that they have as well just sort of makes people think of creepy things. They're gray and cinnamon above and white below. A lot of them have these spots across the chest. They can also have a tan appearance, which you can kind of see in this picture, a little bit of like a cream color to tan. And then that heart-shaped face and dark eyes are very distinctive. A lot of our other owls have yellow eyes or maybe orange eyes. Females are often darker colored than males, but there's a lot of variation between the genders, so sometimes it can be really hard to tell. Something interesting is those spots that you see sort of across the chest and neck of the owl. They're not just ornamental. So apparently the more spots a female has, the more resistant she seems to be to parasites and the more attractive she is to males. So it's sort of like a badge of honor that says, hey, I'm really strong. There's not going to be a lot that takes me down. So I'm a really good female to breed with. I will make very strong babies. They also seem to have a supernatural ability to pinpoint noises in very low or no light. So even more so than some of the other owls, it seems like they really have amazing hearing. And again, that satellite dish face is really going to filter that sound in. And like all owls, their ears are off-centered, so one is slightly higher than the other, and that makes owls really great at pinpointing sound in general. So in terms of their size and measurements, again, we're getting a little bit bigger than those little screech owls. So we have an overall length of between 12 and a half to about 16 inches. Their wingspan can vary from about 39 to 49 inches. And then their weight varies from 14 to about 25 ounces. And so in terms of other birds, they're about the size of a crow. So again, for owls, still fairly small, but significantly larger than our little eastern screech owl. Another interesting fact about the barn owl is that they have a pretty worldwide distribution. So this is an owl that is seen across the world. So all the areas you see there in green have populations of the barn owl. The only places they are not found are sort of in the circumpolar areas, and they're not really fans of desert regions, which is why you see some of those areas in the green that are sort of blocked out with white. So they don't do really well in super open areas where there aren't trees and other cover. And again, some of the Pacific islands in Indonesia, they're also not found there. So there may just be something about those particular habitats that doesn't really work for them, but they have a pretty wide range beyond that. They're a little more particular with what they eat compared to some of the other owls. So as you can see, lots of small mammals, so things like voles and mice and shrews and rats. They will sometimes go after songbirds. So we've got a starling there in the upper right. So again, small to medium-sized birds are pretty typical for them to go after. But because they really hunt mainly at night and in the deep part of the night, they're not really going to go after a whole lot of birds compared to a lot of these mammals. The rabbit on the bottom, again, because it's a smaller owl, it's probably going after younger rabbits. It would be pretty hard for them to carry off a full adult rabbit, especially the ones that I see in my yard, which are pretty big. I'd be fairly surprised if they could lift that off the ground. In terms of nesting and breeding, they can use cavities like the eastern screech owl, but they'll also make use of any other type of human structure or ledge or cliff, just something that has an overhang and is a little protected. So even things like small caves, they would make use of for their nests. One of the reasons they're called barn owls is because they have been found historically in barns, and they still are. So a big reason for their decline across the eastern US and here in the southeast is that they typically tend to stick around places like farmlands. They like really big open areas with some trees sort of on the periphery. And then they typically make the barns and human structures their nesting spots. And so farmers were going into their barns and finding these big birds sitting up in the rafters and having nests and babies and making use of that structure. And so now typically where they're found is places where it's abandoned buildings or kind of dilapidated, falling apart farmhouses out in the middle of nowhere. And they're still able to get in and out of that structure, maybe from an open window or holes in the building, but they love that amount of cover and protection. The females, interesting enough, will make the nest out of their own regurgitated pellets. So a lot of us have probably heard of owl pellets. So not only do owls poop like all other birds, but they actually regurgitate a lot of their undigestible food into these pellets. And I don't know if I would want to be a baby sitting and laying around in a bunch of my mom's puke, but apparently it works for the barn owls. Who knew? They also lay about 2 to 6 eggs per brood, and again, only one brood per year. Incubation period, again, is about a month, with the nestling period being another month after that. These guys are also pretty solitary and territorial. So again, even when barn owls were more plentiful, you weren't going to see multiple pairs in an area. They're going to stay pretty spread out and sort of really protect that territory that they have control over. Next is our barred owl. This is probably the most commonly encountered owl in North Carolina and certainly in our area here in the Piedmont. Very common throughout our state and also really highly adaptable. So these owls can be found in a lot of neighborhoods. I know that I regularly hear them calling in my neighborhood in Johnston County, and I also have had them in pretty much every park I've ever worked at here throughout Wake County. And again, lots of reports of these. They're fairly typically active during the day in comparison to a lot of the other owls. So, for example, I used to work at Eno River State Park in Durham, and we had a couple of areas in the park where if you went out sometime in the mid-afternoon, like 3 or 4 o'clock, you would almost be guaranteed to run into these barred owls that had territories set up. And they would just be sitting up in the tree and they'd be awake and they'd be looking at you as you walked by. And it was pretty amazing to be able to have that daytime encounter with an owl. I certainly hear pairs calling pretty frequently in the daytime as well, both at home and at work. And again, if you're out at night, you have a pretty good chance of encountering them, especially if you're in areas with a lot of great habitat. As you can see, the barred owl also has excellent camouflage. And if you think about sort of dappled sunlight coming through the trees, it has that same sort of pattern across its back and even on its front. So across the back, there's sort of like little areas of white kind of speckled throughout, mostly brown. And on its chest, it's the reverse. They have sort of a white chest and stomach, and then lots of brown streaks sort of falling down in sort of a teardrop pattern. So no matter what direction it's sitting, it's got that sort of dappled sunlight camouflage working for it. The male and female plumage is identical, but if you see a pair together, it's easy to figure out who is who, because like most owls, the females are larger. So in this case, barred owl females are about 30% heavier than males. So that's a pretty distinct size difference between the two. And here is their typical call, followed by a pair. So that is what they are known for. It's the who cooks for you, who cooks for you all call. So owls tend to be some of the easier bird groups to learn their calls and be able to distinguish between them. So again, the barred owl says, who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? And here's a pair. So with that second call, you can hear that it sounded like there was possibly a third one. They kept going. So there may have been a third one that kept recording. Oh my goodness, they are not stopping. Okay, we're gonna move along because that recording was going crazy. So as I was trying to say, often when you get a pair like that, you may actually hear additional owls. And a lot of times when the young have fledged, they might get in on that conversation as well. But they can get really worked up. And one of those owls still sort of kept their deeper voice and sort of the hoo hoo hoo. But a lot of times they'll sound like a group of monkeys just sort of chattering and screeching up in the trees. So that seems to be when the pair gets really excited. So they may just be communicating with one another, and one's come back from hunting and maybe they haven't seen each other for a while, or they may just be communicating something else that they're really concerned or excited about. But it's pretty amazing the vocal range that barred owls have. So in terms of size, they're somewhere between a crow and a goose, which I know is a very large range. But again, this is going to be one of our larger owls. So compared to the barn owl, I would say it's probably at least double the size. Barn owls tend to be a little bit more thin and sort of smaller in appearance overall. And these are starting to get more of that stocky, chunky owl appearance. In terms of length, they tend to be between 17 and 20 inches long. And again, all of these measurements are from head to tail. Wingspan is between 39 and 43 and a half inches, and weight about 16 and a half to 37 ounces. So again, like a lot of birds, owls are really light. A lot of their bulky appearance comes from those feathers, but a lot of times if you strip them down and just looked at their bodies, they're actually really small underneath all of that fluff. So the range of the barred owl, again, covers pretty much the entire eastern coast of the United States, goes a good distance across the United States into the Midwest, and then carries up into a lot of Canada, especially in the western part of that area. So pretty good range. Again, not going to migrate. So the barred owls that we see here in the summer are going to be the same barred owls we see here in the winter, and they are going to breed here. They do typically breed in the winter time, like a lot of owls, which seems sort of counterintuitive because the conditions can be a little bit harsher, and of course the cold temperatures. But a lot of folks think that this is partly because they can get a jump on the prey animals once spring kicks in. So their babies are going to be well on their way to being adults once spring kicks in, and then you've got a plentiful source of food, and those babies have a really easy time sort of becoming independent and having lots of options. Their home territories can be about 700 acres. So they do tend to be territorial and sort of keep those areas free of other owls, especially other barred owls. They'll certainly chase out and go after screech owls that enter their territory. But again, it sort of depends on the type of habitat and the quality. So there are some barred owls that have adapted to living closer to one another than that. But you know, if you're in your neighborhood and you're hearing owls over and over again, chances are it's the same pair that is staying there and has kept that territory year after year. So in terms of food, barred owls, unlike some of our other owls, tend to prefer habitats near water. So forested wetlands are really popular with them, and as a result, they do eat a lot of things like crayfish. They will occasionally go after fish and things of that nature. But again, for the most part, a lot of mammals are going to be in their diet, as well as a mix of reptiles, amphibians, small birds. They tend to eat a lot of crayfish because of the habitats that they stay in. So that's sort of one of their food choices that they're known for. And again, very varied diet because this is a larger owl. So pretty much anything it can catch, it's going to eat. So in terms of nesting, they also will use cavities. Sometimes they will build on existing platform nests as well. So if they have a large tree that has some good branches and they're able to build an external nest that's not in a cavity, that may be something that you see as well. It may be harder and harder for them to find cavities that are large enough for them and their babies to be able to stay in. And unlike our little screech owl, they actually do add small items to the nest. So they might line it with their own feathers. They may pull lichen and moss from areas and line that as well, so their babies have a nice soft spot to lay. They will lay between 1 and 5 eggs. They only have one brood per year. And as you can see in a lot of these pictures, even though they're laying up to 5 eggs, a lot of times they may only have 2 of those eggs hatch. So they don't necessarily have 4 or 5 babies per brood. They may have 1 or 2 or possibly 3. Again, typical incubation and nesting period, about a month apiece. And again, like a lot of our other owls, those babies are going to stick around and let mom and dad take care of them for quite some time afterwards. Kind of an interesting fun fact about barred owls is in some areas where they have a great water source, they eat so many crayfish that it actually turns their feathers around their belly pink. So if you think of some of our other local birds like the red-bellied woodpecker, who gets those really pink and red feathers in breeding season to attract the females, these guys sort of have the same sort of side issue of their food coloring their feathers, really similar to flamingos, who are known for some of their coloration based on the food they eat. So same thing here. You've got these owls in certain areas that tend to get this pinkish tinge to their feather, especially on the belly, and that's mainly because of their food source. So it's kind of an interesting thing that happens over time. And the little inset picture on the bottom left is just showing those edges of the feather. So they have these really soft feathers. If you've ever held an owl feather versus a hawk feather, they're very different. Hawk feathers are very rough and kind of, you can tell that they have very um, smooth edges, where with the owl, they have these little projections along the edge of these really soft feathers, and that allows the air to pass through, and it actually gives them that silent flight. So those feathers are uniquely adapted for owls to be able to fly silently in the nighttime and truly sneak up on their prey, where a lot of the times raptors, their prey is going to hear them coming no matter what time of day it is. An interesting study that took place here in North Carolina several years ago in Charlotte sort of helped to dispel the myth that barred owls needed old growth forests and very specific habitat to be able to be successful. That was a long held opinion by a lot of scientists for a long time. And then a student did a study in Charlotte and discovered that there was a really healthy, thriving populations of barred owls right there in the middle of the city. And a big part of that is because a lot of the historic and older neighborhoods throughout Charlotte kept a lot of their original trees. So as you can see in that bottom right picture, you have these houses and a pretty typical neighborhood with, you know, yards and roads and traffic, but you had these great trees that provided enough cover and habitat for the owls to be able to adapt to that environment. And they're still finding lots of food. So something they found with catching the owls and monitoring their behavior is that they found that city owls eat less frequently than owls in sort of natural habitats, more rural and suburban. And what they were doing is eating larger meals less frequently. So they weren't having to go out and hunt quite as much. And of course, being in a city, you're going to have a lot more issues with things like traffic collisions and running into buildings. And so it's probably better that they adapted to hunting less frequently and sort of staying close to their nest or roost trees. The great horned owl. So this is our largest native owl to North Carolina. Not the largest one in the presentation, but certainly the largest owl that is commonly found in our state. As a result, it doesn't really have a whole lot of predators, and most of the other owls are going to steer clear of it. And if the great horned owl moves into the neighborhood, the barred owls and other owls that may have existing territories may decide to just move on. Some may try to fight for their territory, but because the great horned owl is sort of the top of the owl food chain and much bigger and much more ferocious than any other species, most of them are going to just let him have the territory and find another suitable habitat elsewhere. Great horned owls also have those little horns or ear projections that we saw in the eastern screech owl. These are sort of down for the moment, but a lot of times they will still have that silhouette of those two sort of triangular projections at the top of the head. Beautiful bright yellow eyes that you can see here. And again, a very dark overall plumage. So lots of browns and kind of going into dark brown or black. Lots of different modeling because again, they're going to be up in these trees. So they want to be as camouflaged as possible. Mostly to sneak up on prey, not necessarily for predators. But they do get harassed by a lot of animals, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But here is the typical great horned owl call. So I apologize, that sounded a little softer than I had expected it to be when I did my playthrough earlier. So they have a lower voice and they tend to do just a series of hoots, and it's supposed to say, "Who's awake? Me too." So it'll be hoo, 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 hoo. And they'll just repeat that over and over again. So great horned owl measurements. Again, this is going to be our largest native owl, 18 to about 25 inches long body wise. The wingspan is going to be between 40 and 57 inches, which is pretty long. Weight, we're up to 32 to 88 ounces. And again, somewhere between a crow and a goose, but they are obviously larger than our barred owl. The bottom picture shows an adult with those ear projections fully erect, and then next to it is sort of a nestling who is not quite ready to fledge. And lots of these owl babies, especially the great horned owls, they tend to look like giant cotton balls, which are pretty cute. The range of the great horned owl is completely throughout North America. So as you can see, it extends all the way up through Canada and into Alaska, and all the way down into Mexico and even into Central America. So pretty wide ranging common owl throughout the United States. Certainly pretty common here in the Southeast. But again, I would say you're going to encounter and hear barred owls much more frequently than great horned owl. And part of that may just be the type of territory that they like to set up. They're not quite as adapted to neighborhoods as the barred owls have become. They have probably the most diverse diet of all of the owls that we have here in North Carolina. And part of that is because of their size. So again, everything ranging from other owls like our little screech owl, bats, small mammals, larger mammals, or say medium mammals like skunks and rabbits. You might have to watch your outdoor cats if you have a great horned owl in the neighborhood. They have been shown on video taking adult house cats. And again, they're going to eat some smaller things like toads and frogs and fish. They will also go after waterfowl. So that lower left is a coot, which is a smaller waterfowl that we see here a lot in the wintertime. So again, if their territory includes a water source, they will go after small ducks and other waterfowl. They tend to be known for some pretty gruesome acts that they perform on their prey. For larger animals that they don't think they'd be able to carry off whole, they have a tendency to decapitate their larger prey and leave the head behind and just carry off the body. And in some cases, they'll even remove legs and wings. So anything that's going to be the heavier parts of the animals and not as edible, they will basically dismember and decapitate and leave a pile of parts behind and then just carry off the part of the carcass that they'll be able to eat later. So pretty gruesome, kind of a horror story in itself. In terms of nesting and breeding, they're sort of an interesting study in contrast. So they're these brutal predators that dismember and decapitate their prey, but they also tend to be known as very nurturing parents. So that photo you see in the bottom left is really typical. They'll be snuggling with their babies and using their body warmth to keep them warm throughout the wintertime when it's early in that nesting season and it may still have very cold temperatures. So one parent is always on the nest, always using their body heat to keep those babies warm and snuggly. And they're very doting on these babies all the way until they're large enough to almost fledge on their own. So they will also use cavities, but I have also seen external nests more often than cavities. So the times that I have seen great horned owl pairs, I've been able to see that large nest like you see in that top left picture. So I don't know which one they tend to do more often. I tend to sort of say that they would probably be more external nests. And a lot of that is probably because there's not a lot of structures available that are either safe enough if they're man-made or large enough if they're natural to be able to house them and their babies. They will also line nests with their own feathers or other soft materials that they collect. Again, 1 to 4 eggs, pretty typical, only one brood per year. Their nestling period is a little bit longer. Most of the others are about a month. This one is 42 days. And again, that's going to extend into when those babies are still sort of almost ready to fledge, but still begging mom and dad to bring them food so they don't have to do it themselves. The babies have a begging call that they do, so they're a lot more vocal than a lot of the other young owls. And here's what that sounds like. So again, that little feed me, feed me. They have a lot of really funny and unique behaviors when it comes to predators and prey. So they love to make themselves look really big and ferocious. Again, they're already a pretty big apex predator in most of their habitats, but they like to really fluff themselves up. So the two pictures on the left are sort of them being like, look at how big and scary I am. And they will sometimes do this while they're perched and just sort of fluff themselves up and sort of push their head forward with those large eyes. They do clap their bill. So when they are upset or trying to give a warning to their mate, they do a lot of bill clapping and hissing. So they have a lot of different noises they'll make to try to scare things away. I love that photo on the bottom left where they have put their entire body into it. So that is the biggest great horned owl I have ever seen in my whole life. And it's like every individual feather is splayed as far as it can possibly go. Bottom right, this is pretty typical. So because great horned owls are really ferocious predators, they will go after adult birds, baby birds, eggs, whatever they can find. A lot of birds will do what's called mobbing behavior and try to harass a great horned owl away from their territory and their nesting area. And we see this a lot with crows. So you can see here, there's a little gang of crows harassing this poor little great horned owl who's just trying to sit up in a tree and have a good day. And they are pretty relentless about it. So they will just constantly swoop down, make a lot of noise. Oftentimes they get a lot of other birds involved. So anytime you hear a lot of birds making a lot of noise, I would say go investigate, because chances are you're going to either find a raptor like an owl or a hawk, or a snake. You're going to find something cool no matter what. But birds really make a lot of fuss when there's a predator in the area. So a lot of times they're unsuccessful and the owl will just sort of sit there looking really annoyed while they bombard it. Sometimes they'll give up if they realize the owl's not going to move along, but every once in a while they're successful, as you can see in that bottom right photo, and they'll make the owl fly away to another location. It's hard to be a great horned owl. All right, and finally, this one is sort of a unique owl for the list. So snowy owls, we are not in the typical range of the snowy owl, but in the last decade or so, we've had some really interesting times of year and occurrences of snowy owls here in North Carolina. And as a bird watcher, that gets you really Twitter-pated and excited, because this is an owl that we would typically have to travel very far up north, like into Canada and the far reaches of like Minnesota, to be able to see this species. So having it show up at the Outer Banks of North Carolina is pretty amazing and really causes a lot of excitement. So the snowy owl is by far the largest owl that we have in North America. They are unique in a lot of ways, partly because they really only like to live in open areas. So they're not really tree related owls. They sort of like big, wide open spaces, which is why sometimes when they get flown off course, they end up in places like airports or sand dunes out in the Outer Banks. They like to be up in the tundra. So again, not a lot of trees, just really wide open spaces. So they can basically sit on a fence post or a low shrub and be able to see for miles. And that's basically their hunting style. And here's what they sound like. So again, not that hoo-hoo that we're used to, but sort of a low grunting sound. And oftentimes they will stay pretty silent in their territories. Again, they're greatly camouflaged for where they typically live in the snow and the tundras. Not so much when they show up in places like the Outer Banks, or in Charlotte in the middle of an airport. They're going to stand out a lot. But again, they're supposed to be camouflaged for their native territory. So their overall length is between 20 and 30 inches. Wingspan is somewhere between 50 and 57. Their weight, so again, a much heavier owl, 56 to 104 ounces. They're going to be a lot closer to the goose than the crow in terms of size. But again, you've got a lot of color variation here. Sometimes they will have a lot more of these sort of dark speckles across. Those are typically found on the females because they're going to be on the nest, and that does help them to blend in better. The males are going to be a lot more white and sometimes not have any sort of speckling across the chest. This is the typical range of the snowy owl. So as you can see, North Carolina is a long way from where they should be. And that little dotted line is what we call the eruptive section. And an eruption year basically means it's an interesting year where their food source in their native habitat is so scarce that it basically pushes them further south to look for food. And so it's strictly a survival thing. And so we get other birds that do that on occasion here in North Carolina, things like the red-breasted nuthatches or purple finches, pine siskins. A lot of times there'll be winter birds that we just have a year where we see a lot of them, and we don't typically see them year to year. And that's just mainly because wherever they are supposed to be, the food source for that year, something may have happened with the weather or some other type of damage event, and they're having to travel further in order to survive through the winter to be able to return to their breeding grounds. So this is the same for the snowy owl. So that used to be sort of the historic eruptive area, so going down into maybe the northern half of Virginia, but now they have been found as far south as Florida. Again, this is their typical habitat and range up there in the green. So again, pretty polar tundra type environments. The pictures on the bottom sort of show the type of environments they are really adapted to and prefer. So very large open spaces, very easy to see for a long way, which is great when you're looking for predators like Arctic wolves and foxes, but also when you're looking for prey. You can see a lot of movement for a long way away. Their number one food source is lemmings. So when the lemming population is down, that is what creates an eruptive year for snowy owls. But they also eat things like ptarmigans and snowshoe hares and waterfowl, which will also be in those regions that they are native to in the wintertime and throughout the rest of their breeding season. But again, lemmings is by far their main food source. These guys just drop their nest right on the ground in the tundra. They will typically be on a little rise. So again, you want to be elevated so you can sort of keep an eye out for predators, have your little hill where you can have a 360 view. The female will use her body to make a depression for the nest and then use her body heat to keep those eggs and babies warm throughout those harsh conditions. They will lay more eggs than most owls, probably because it's really hard to keep all of those babies alive. So they're sort of, playing the odds and laying as many eggs and starting off with as many chicks as possible, knowing that likely the vast majority of them are not going to make it to adulthood. Again, one brood per year because it's a lot of work to be an owl parent. Their nestling period is actually a little shorter than typical, and that's probably by design because those babies really need to hurry up and get to be independent so they can fend for themselves as quickly as possible. There's a really cool website you can check out if you're interested in learning more about snowy owls. It's called Project Snowstorm. This has been going on for several years, and they actually have trackers on some of these snowy owls, and they've been able to track specific owls back and forth, and certainly when they have these eruptions and they're traveling further south than would be typical for them. So they've been able to get some really good information and start to piece together this puzzle of, predicting when these eruptions might occur or why they're occurring, and also finding out the mortality rates of these owls that are getting blown so far off course. For North Carolina, we had a great eruptive year back in the winter of 2013 to 2014. There were 15 different owls confirmed across the state, and that went from the Outer Banks to I think at least Charlotte, if not further west. In the winter of 2017 to 18, there was another good eruptive year. There was one at the Outer Banks, one in Winston-Salem, and one in Greensboro. Again, this is what I refer to as my nemesis species. So when you're a bird watcher, any bird you've made several attempts to see with zero success becomes your nemesis bird. And that is the snowy owl for me. So one day I will see a snowy owl. It just has not happened yet. I had a couple other chances in 2020 and 2024 when we had confirmed sightings, one in the Outer Banks and one out in Hyde County, sort of where Lake Mattamuskeet is, which is another great birding area. So again, every winter brings a new possibility for a snowy owl to arrive in North Carolina. And with that, I think we're just about at time, and I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Colleen. We really that was great. I learned so much. Um, so we did have a couple of questions. There was one about the barn owl and the shape of the face,
Yeah,
and just the reason for that apple shape.
yeah, that's a good question. I would have to look up if they have figured out why that was adapted so specifically. But I do know that, most of them have that satellite dish face shape and sort of the depression that helps filter sound. But for whatever reason, that barn owl just sort of became that heart shaped and was just more, I don't know, it seems very like distinct and almost like fine tuned. And I think that's why they end up being the best hunters in full dark conditions. But I don't really know how that happened that way. That's a good question.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's a great answer. Thank you. And then we had, can barn owls and barred owls overlap their territories?
Yes. So barred owls are much more adaptable to different types of habitats. So you could potentially have them in the same general area. They would probably still have distinct territories from one another. But again, a lot of our farmlands can be near places like, forested wetlands or near streams and creeks. And that's really where barred owls love to be. So certainly when you have their two preferred habitats kind of coming together, I wouldn't be surprised if they were nearby. And again, because they're not really competing for their nesting sites, their territories may sort of bump up against each other.
Awesome. And then we had another question. This is actually a great one that I had wanted to know as well. Do owls stay together with their mates or just until the babies leave the nest?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I didn't mention that. So a lot of the owl species we have here in North Carolina are monogamous and will mate for life unless one of those two in the pair pass away, then they will that the surviving mate will go out and find a new mate. However, there has been some, I want to say it was the screech owl and barred owl that even though they're quote unquote mostly monogamous, there have been cases where they have found a male having two females at the same time. So that's a busy boy going back and forth between two families, so to speak. But for the most part, they do tend to be monogamous and mate for life.
Awesome. Thank you. And I was just going to say real quick, we have a couple of resources for folks. We have Jennifer Ackerman's What an Owl Knows at the library. I've just dropped the link in the chat. So it's a whole book about owls if you're interested. And then we also have a flip guide that connects you with resources related to all things birds and birding that we have at the library. And so this recording will be there, and we've got the recording that Colleen did for us last year, which was fantastic. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop the last minute questions in the chat if you have them. But we hope that you really enjoyed this presentation. Oh, we've got another question here. This is a good one. Does living in an urban environment mess with the owl sleep schedules at all?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I'm involved in our local Audubon chapter, Wake Audubon, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with our Lights Out campaign, but there's been a big push in recent years from a lot of organizations to turn lights out and try to make our neighborhoods and cities as dark as possible. A lot of times it's centered around migration to help birds from getting confused or running into buildings, but there have been a lot of studies that artificial light is really messing up a lot of wildlife's just basic functions. And this goes from insects all the way up to mammals. So birds are certainly affected. So I think that, again, birds are going to try to find the best habitats possible. But I know, like, for example, in my neighborhood, I have zero light in my yard but a lot of my neighbors have those huge spotlights that come on or stay on. And so there's this constant light pollution, and that certainly affects owls. They're going to be having a harder time finding prey, hunting, because again, they are adapted to hunting in the dark. They can certainly use light to their advantage, but when there's too much light, it's going to have the opposite effect and just sort of mess up their sight and their navigation. So it also tends to throw off things like breeding periods. They may not be getting as much sleep as they usually would because, again, that light is interrupting that cycle. So I would say for sure, light pollution is going to have a big impact on them, just like a lot of other organisms. So anything that we can do to keep things as dark as possible is really beneficial.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's see. Max has a question here. Does the park that you work for, Colleen, have a reptile program and other avian programs?
Yes, so we do a variety of programs. So we're mainly based at the White Deer Park Nature Center, but we also do programs at Lake Benson Park, which is right across the street from us. But those are sort of the two big parks here in the town of Garner. And we do a wide variety of programs for all ages, from preschool to adults. And we do have some live animals here. So we have corn snakes and some yellow-bellied sliders. So our animal programs are always very popular. And I do monthly bird walks. So I certainly would love to have you all come out and join me for one of my bird walks. And again, we're pretty adaptable. If you have a program that you'd like to see or have here, we are certainly willing to work with you and make it happen.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your knowledge and your willingness to answer our questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then everybody